Thank you, John. Does this work? There we go. So the problem statement for this policy proposal is that businesses have a need to lease IPv4 space. And we know that that's the case because it's going on right now, legitimately or non-legitimately, on the radar or not on the radar. So this policy proposal suggests 3 possible changes, of which 2 are expected to go through as a way of addressing that. One of the things I will be looking for from the community is guidance on which of the 2 proffered changes to 852 might be considered preferable. So let's talk about the original policy language in section 2.4. It describes a local internet registry, and the operative term is at the end where we talk about generally internet service providers whose customers are primarily end users and possibly other ISPs. So it creates this nexus where you're getting a circuit, you're getting a VPN, etc. So the proposed language for section 2.4 adds on to that, and the section that's added on is italicized at the end here. The LIRs may also assign address space to other organizations or customers to request it for use in an operational network. 2 potential changes to 852. One is that we get rid of 852 already, and I'm going to read through the strikeout there for anyone who's having difficulty for that. 852 describes operational use. ARIN allocates or assigns number resources to organizations via transfer solely for the purpose of use on an operational network. So if we get rid of that, that's easy. It means that you can do leasing without the need for a downstream circuit VPN connection. Another possibility is modify section 8.2 by adding on to it, but may allocate or assign number resources to organizations for other purposes, including reassignment to non-connected networks. So this was brought forward on PPML, and discussion ensued. A lot of discussion centered around, what does this non-connected network mean anyway, and can't they use Net 10 for it? Well, that's not what was meant by non-connected. Non-connected was intended by the authors to mean that there is no circuit here, that we are engaging in the subdelegation of number resources just like an ISP does, but without the circuit in place. We're going to make that abundantly clear in the policy text post-meeting. We decided not to do that pre-meeting and to present it as is. Another problem is that the implementation details are unclear, and that's going to show up again in a later slide as specific questions. Would the adoption of this policy mean that we can use leased out address spaces to demonstrate efficient use, meaning as a recipient? Can we use these address spaces, and we've used this address space, now we need to get some space from ARIN. Can we bring this forward? Is it documented in such a way that we can bring this forward as a sign that we've used space properly? That's basically the same thing in the second question. The third, though, and I'm going to elaborate on the third on the next slide, is can the lessor organization say, hey, we've leased out 90% of our address space. We well meet the requirements to get more space from ARIN, except for this problem earlier on with what the address space was being used for. So does this proposal boil down to, can an LIR that is leasing space out use that as justification with ARIN to get more space on the transfer market? There was meta-discussion of ARIN's role and the amount of control that we exert over how people use address space and when they're able to get address space. For those in the room who may not be aware, the constraints that are exercised in the RIPE region are much looser than those in the ARIN region. Some clarifying language has been proposed. We have not yet integrated that. So the questions that are before the community today, remembering that this is a draft proposal and we're working on it, are: do you support the intent of the policy, which is to decouple formally an IP address reassignment from network services so that it can be properly reflected in WHOIS? This is good for WHOIS health and accuracy. Do you support option 1, removing 852 entirely? Do you support option 2, modifying 852? And how about the implementation details? We would like to hear the fine points of how this should actually go into play. And I'm going to flip back to that when we have people up at the microphones. So, thank you.
All right. Front center microphone.
Andrew Dahl, 8 Continents, ARIN AC. I oppose the removal of 852. We very specifically inserted that section into the transfer policy because we want transfers to go to people who operate networks, not people who lease addresses. So that was very intentional. I would be okay perhaps with modifying that section. However, I think we also need to start thinking, if we are going to go down the road of allowing leasing, what constitutes a majority of an organization operating an operational network versus a side business of leasing versus an entity which is primarily for leasing and doesn't really operate an operational network.
Rear microphone.
Hi, my name is Kieran Malanchar-Uville. I am the original author of the policy proposal, so thank you for the community discussion thus far. I sent out an email last night with some clarifying language, and I just wanted to note that for you in case you haven't been on the PPML since last night, which is understandable. The clarifying language, first of all, as Rob has already said, I wanted to clarify my intent about non-connected networks to mean reassignment to organizations and entities which do not receive connectivity from the original registrant. I think that Rob already made that clear, but just to clarify in my own words. A suggested edit to remove the confusion about non-connected networks of 8.5.2 is would read: ARIN allocates or assigns number resources to organizations via transfer primarily, as opposed to solely, for the purpose of use on an operational network, but may allocate or assign number resources to organizations for other purposes, including reassignment to organizations and entities which do not receive connectivity from the original registrant. So I hope that makes or clears up some of the confusion that we saw on the PPML. And my apologies for not being clear. I am a newcomer to ARIN, so I appreciate your patience. A couple of other things that I wanted to mention. Of course, we know IPv4 leasing is inevitable. It already happens, and there's an increasing need for it as a result of the cost of obtaining IPv4 space and the absolute barrier that a lot of small to medium enterprises encounter. They have a need for IPv4 space, and they may not have the huge blocks of cash that they need to purchase or transfer IPv4 space to themselves on the current transfer market. So the purpose of this policy is really about equity and equitable distribution of IPv4 space and helping small to medium enterprises that can't get financing and don't have the cash to obtain what they need as far as IPv4 space is concerned. So that's our primary consideration with this. Also, we understand, I had a number of questions directed at me this week about what our motivations are. That really is it primarily. Although also, of course, security, accurate WHOIS, encouraging sort of more consistent use of SWIPing and accurate SWIP records are key as well. And then finally, I just wanted to note that this, I very much appreciate the conversation about what this does with the needs-based requirement in ARIN, which I think seems to be very precious to this community, and rightfully so. I don't think that this necessarily means that needs-based justification for space is eliminated solely because the ability to lease to small businesses is now a legitimized environment, as opposed to sort of technically or even sort of prohibited in the minds of the community as a practice that isn't necessarily a black market, but certainly at least a gray market. I think that we want to make sure that when we legitimize a practice, it opens up the opportunity for smart business solutions to address it, to address the security concerns that exist with the current leasing market, to address any of the issues that we see. So we're hoping certainly that, and we have no expectation that criminality will go away, but we do think that we have an opportunity to address some of the problems that we see in the leasing space with smart trust and safety solutions, and that's another one of our motivations. So I thank you for your consideration, and that's it. Thanks.
Thank you. Front center microphone.
Scott Johnson, SolarNet 1. As I said yesterday, I was a participant in the 6-bone. We've been working on V6 for quite some time now. I've been deploying it myself personally for over 15 years. I have to oppose this policy change both completely in spirit and context. This change would allow the creation of the concept of IP address space to be viewed as something like a paid parking lot. As well, it would create a class of landlords for internet address space, which could very easily lead to the similar practice of slumlording and other parasitic type of action as associated with a common public resource that was created by a group of dedicated engineers to serve the public good. I don't see how this serves the public good. I see how this only serves commercial interests who are looking to profit off the work of others. Thank you.
Thank you. Far microphone.
Kevin Bloomberg, The Wire. I support the concept. I don't support any of the text here. And I want to point out that the concept of LIR in the ARIN region, at least, has never really been used. It was a placeholder. LIR equals ISP. But that's not the case in other regions. And I think we need to look to the other regions. APNIC has a very strong LIR NIR community as an example. And I think we need to look to those regions, how they worked with their LIRs, and write proper policy to encompass actually doing it properly. There are two reasons for this. One, we know this is in existence. We know this has been going on for many, many years, and we know all that is doing is affecting the accuracy of the whois when it comes to these net blocks. So we're kidding ourselves in thinking it's not going on, or that by us not doing a policy, it's going to suddenly have all the space come back. All we're doing is affecting the accuracy. This is also, when done properly, a good environment. I worked for an organization, they managed 1,000 companies that were within the ARIN region. They did everything for these companies. They washed their dishes if they had to, but each one of these companies had to go to ARIN. They would lose their space every once in a while because they would forget, because they weren't responsible for this stuff. The company that managed them did everything. They would be a perfect example of an LIR. We handle everything for these small companies, including the ARIN registration. So there are lots of use cases, and we can look around the world at how they've been done, whether they've been done at a national level or a company level. But ultimately, we need to be responsible for the who-is accuracy. This would help with that. And we need to protect it and write a good policy that encompasses all of the requirements with that. Thank you.
Thank you, Kevin. Front microphone.
Owen DeLong, ARIN-AC. I'm not opposed to the concept of leasing. I'm not particularly in favor of it either. Excuse me. I do think that the wording in this policy needs to be pretty much completely scrapped and start over. For other purposes than use on an operational network is a phrasing I just can't stomach. There is no other reason to issue address space other than for use in an operational network. It may not be that the use in an operational network is going to be by the exact person who's receiving the space. They may be leasing it to somebody else for use in an operational network. We can find a way to structure language about that. But if we create language that says we will issue space for other purposes, I don't know what those purposes would be, but I can't imagine that it's anything good other than use in an operational network, because I don't know what else you would do with IP addresses than use them in an operational network. Thank you.
Thanks, Owen. Rear microphone.
Mike Burns, IP Trading. I'm a RIPE LIR. In RIPE, there's such a thing as PI space, which is space that belongs to entities other than the LIR who sponsors that space. And it's the same relationship we're looking at here. We're just trying to turn lessors into ISPs and allow them to reallocate their space. Now, in terms of the language, I would get rid of 852. It just never belonged there in the first place. That kind of statement belongs at the top of the NERPM. It just describes the overall goals of ARIN. In fact, it's already there. So 852 should be gone. But in terms of the implementation, I was the one who asked that last question about can I purchase addresses and justify them with leases. And to answer that myself, I would say if I were able to do that, it would require the same sort of activity that an ISP would have to perform in order to use his sub-allocations and delegations to justify for more addresses. So that means a SWIP or some kind of a recording of leased out space. It might mean some requirements for the term of the lease. I wouldn't expect to lease a bunch of space for 1 month and have that qualify to justify more space. So I think more work on the language of the implementation should be done. But just a side note on the economics of the lease market. We have acknowledged that it does exist. There's a space in policy that allows it to exist. And obviously it exists because it's addressing a need. But in the past, people who came to lease space were mostly spammers. And that's because the pricing for leases was such that it was a difficult business case for any lessee to make. They could have purchased the space for between 1 year and 2 years of lease payments. So if you could buy the space and you could resell it in 1 year, why would you want to lease it? However, now lease rates have come down significantly, and the economics of the engagement to a lessee are much more attractive. And there was some talk about small businesses, and we do see small companies who can't afford addresses, who see the potential to lease addresses as their only mechanism financially to get into the space. So as long as we implement this thoughtfully with the idea that lessors are analogous to ISPs, I definitely support this. Thank you.
Front microphone.
Chris Tassett Law, ARIN-AC. I fully agree with what Owen said, and I just want to add a little addendum to this. Just like with the brokerage market, when you have a transfer, the transfer doesn't go first to the broker and then to the ultimate recipient. It just, from an ARIN perspective, it's justified by the policy and it goes from the transferor to the transferee. I think we would like to see the same model here, and if that's true, then the resources are still being used for operational use. What happens on the commercial side is a separate issue and shouldn't concern us, but having that transparency in the leasing market would certainly help us improve database accuracy, and that would be the value of it. So for that reason, conceptually, I like the idea for us to, as a community, to try and get our handle on the leasing market and make it more transparent and have it reflected in the database, but this isn't the way to do it right now. Thank you.
I have a follow-up question for you, and it's actually a follow-up question for everybody in the room, since you are advocating for keeping the lessor organization in the proposal out of the middle and having the transaction happen directly with ARIN. They would be providing the money to acquire some assets and then receiving a return on that. Yet, the number resources are not something that would be securitizable at this point because of demonstrated need. You couldn't take them back. It's not like a house where that's pledged as the security for your mortgage, and if you don't pay, well, you know, it goes back.
Right.
Can you think of, and I don't need an answer right now if you don't have
Sure,
something in your
understood.
hip pocket, but can you think of a way to accommodate that within our needs-based system where the security interest of the folks who are providing the capital is protected? Because I absolutely agree with the folks who say, you know, the little guy's being held over a barrel right now.
Right, yeah. That's something I'd have to think about, but it's an important practical consideration from a market operation perspective. And obviously we have to try, our goal should try to be to align ARIN policy to the reality of commercial practices, but without compromising ARIN's core mission. Because if we're not trying to sacrifice the mission to improve database accuracy, we're trying to improve database accuracy within ARIN's mission.
Yep.
And so we need to find a way to reconcile this, but I'll give some thought to that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have there been any remote participants? No? All right. Rear microphone.
Joe Provo, Google ARIN-AC. I have a lot of feels here. This is a pretty, I haven't fully formed all the ideas, but, and I don't want to waste a lot of time extemporizing, but there's a couple of points I have to hit. Kevin's LIR comment is the most clear expression of an actual need that I've heard. When this first floated, I opposed fully in principle and in text, and I still oppose the text. I do think that codifying practices that are currently viewed as, air quotes, bad, on the altar of database accuracy is not the direction we should go, similar to what Chris was saying about not trying to sacrifice our values. So throwing around the word need when we're saying people are doing a thing, therefore they need it, is not the same as our classical definition of needs-based. Secondly, I would posit that the ongoing existence of a gray, very dark gray market of leasing is a pointer to potential fault, if not failure, then actually faults in the existing market-based operation and transfers. Why we made the argument that when we went into a transfer reality, we made the argument that this would provide economic incentives to allow resources to migrate to where they are needed to be used. And if that's not fitting the needs, then do we need to re-examine the current transfer policies to enable this behavior to fold within it? Is there actually people are very allergic to this, is there a stronger so-called regulatory hand that should be put into place to make sure that these participants are actually within that space rather than expanding the space of additional marketplaces. And thirdly, what was thirdly? I lost it. Whatever. I'll come back to it on the list.
Thank you, Joe. Placing a last call for the queues, asking people who have something new that they may want to add to join the queues now before we close them. Front center microphone.
David Farmer, University of Minnesota, ARIN-AC. I do not support the text as written. I support the concept. Kevin's had some very good ideas. I also want to bring up that the current, there's an RFC 2008 that talks about the system that we currently use where ISPs loan addresses to their customers. The word loan was actually used at that RFC. Loans and leases, and these are all words that kind of intertwine with each other. And so I think the days where we can practically require the user of the address space to be connected to the ISP that's loaning them the address space is an anachronism in the current state of IPv4. And so we need to figure out how to describe this. There's definitely some things that can go awry in all of this, and so we need to sort of describe this correctly and find the right language, but I support the idea.
Thank you, David. Front center microphone again.
Hi, Kathy Aronson. I'm just trying to conceptually understand this, and I'm having a really hard time, so I just kind of want to maybe say it out loud. So basically what you're saying is people want to lease PI space, and that somebody might go and get a big block simply to provide PI space as a business? Is that what you're talking? Is that what this is?
I think what I'm reading is that that's one possible
Okay, so
outcome of this, and
so you
there's a
would-
question as to whether or not there should be language to specifically not allow that or allow that.
Okay, I'm just trying, like, I'm just having a really hard time understanding it. So if I am, I figure other people are. So basically, right now, you really do, as a customer of an ISP, you're still leasing space. It's just leased and attached to the connection that you bought from them. And so what you're saying is that people want blocks of space to use on whatever network and ISP that they choose.
Listen, as I'm seeing it, I'm seeing that there's a couple possible cases of this. One of them is there may be a IP address holder who's using their space but has extra and wants to monetize it or make it available to somebody else who's not connected to them.
And still retain the rights to it.
Right?
Rob really wants.
You want to take it, Rob?
Yeah,
You take it, Rob.
Let me speak to this with an additional data point, which is that PA space is absolutely being monetized today.
Totally.
There are perverse incentives here. If you want to keep the amount of space that we gave you 10 years ago, you better give us more revenue.
Totally.
And that happens every day.
Right. I just think that the wording needs to be, like leasing is just ambiguous because people are leasing address space with their connection to FOO that they connect to. So I'm just personally just trying to understand and put into words what the problem is and what people need. So basically, you're just a little guy. You want a block of address space to use on your network. It's actually being used on an operational network and connecting to some ISP of your choice, right? And you just want to be able to pay something that isn't an outrageous purchase price on the market to do that.
Or even pay as you go.
Yeah, okay, cool. I'm just trying to grok it. Thanks.
Thank you. Rear microphone.
Scott Johnson, SolarNet 1. I rise again to speak to the matter that this is to benefit a small or medium-sized business. Quite frankly, you can't get much smaller than my mom and pop Main Street organization. And yet, I have had no trouble acquiring through existing means in the policy all of the address space I could possibly ever use in my lifetime and the lifetimes of 5 generations to come after me. That's just not dotted quad. That's IPv6, which is the real solution to this problem.
All right, seeing nobody else in queue, we'll consider the microphones closed. Sure.
Sorry. Just in response to Kathy's point, I guess I don't understand, and maybe I'll look forward to further discussion on the list about this to clarify. This might be as a result of my sort of newness here, but I guess I don't really see the problem of getting a block on the market solely for the purpose of leasing if that contributes to sort of a more equitable distribution and equitable access to IPv4. The bottom line is small businesses do not have the money to buy on the current transfer market. And so if a business does have the money to buy on the transfer market, for the purpose of allowing small and medium businesses to access and satisfy this absolute need that they have, I guess I would look forward to some conversation about why that's necessarily a bad thing, or does it just fly in the face of a tradition that makes it uncomfortable?
Kathy?
Oh,
I think that the problem right now is that there's no policy to justify a block if you're not using it to run a network. So like if I went to buy from a broker a block of address space, I have no justification if I don't have a network. So that may be totally fine, but there has to be a policy that allows for that, because right now there isn't.
great, thank you.
Does that help?
If I could.
John?
Yeah. Right now, if you attempt to obtain an address block via the transfer market, and you say, I'm obtaining it so that I can hold on to it and lend it out to people, lease it to people, whatever, but I don't have a network, you're denied, period. Because right now, one of the requirements is that you need to have operational need. You need to say, I'm obtaining addresses from ARIN, or obtaining addresses from the transfer market through ARIN for purposes of an operational network. No network, no transfer.
So I thought a little bit about your question and also your last comments, and perhaps part of the solution here is...
Just restate your name for the
Sorry,
record.
Chris Tassett. Perhaps part of the solution here is to actually, if you're going to allow this sort of thing to happen, to have a utilization requirement within a certain specified period of time, and then the onus is on the party that's actually acquiring these numbers to make sure they're put into use fairly promptly at a pretty high level of utilization. Maybe that's part of the solution. What I don't want to see is having IP addresses inventoried, because that just drives up the price for everyone, and it's contrary to the core mandate of having the resources in operational use.
Thank you. John?
Yeah. So the community should decide what it wants to accomplish and make policy to that end. Consider that the moment that you move to the realm of address space being held by entities that don't operate networks, right now there's a little bit of stickiness when you operate a network. We all know that when you assign addresses to equipment, you generally don't pick them up and capriciously move them around because, well, that's configuration, and who needs extra configuration? But on the other hand, if what you're in the business of doing is providing address space to party for purposes, then when ARIN asks you what's your utilization, you can create utilization very quickly. It's just a record. It's non-confirmable, okay? Your neighbors can get you up to 20, 30, 70, 80, 90% on a temporary lease, and you have that arbitrariness of utilization because it's not actually affected with infrastructure. It's not an auditable thing. That's not to say you can't figure out a way to do this, but the community needs to decide if it's going to go into this realm, what it wants us to verify, and how that might be used Because, for example, someone who wishes to entirely engage in financial speculation of address blocks is immediately enabled the moment there's no requirement for infrastructure. Is that a bug or is that a feature? That's for you guys to decide. But just recognize you have to make the policy pretty clear, because what you think will happen isn't what's going to happen. What will happen is whatever you give us for enforcement, we'll enforce. Whatever you don't, we won't. And that may have different consequences. So it's not a non-trivial matter to drop the operational need. That's not to say it can't be done, but you need to think through and really decide how you want that whole new realm to operate.
All right, final two comments, far microphone.
Hi. Chris Woodfield, Salesforce, ARIN-AC. I know that we explicitly avoid thinking of IP address space as a commodity. But as we talk about similar things like leasing, sometimes that those parallels become uncomfortably unavoidable. Now, I personally have a fundamental and possibly almost religious aversion to the idea of acquiring address space for the purpose of leasing. I also realize that religious beliefs almost never make for good public policy. But I would love to find a way that organizations that have space that could be used could have a mechanism for finding uses for the operational use for that space, such as leasing, while at the same time preventing an organization from acquiring space for the purpose of leasing. I hate to bring in parallels to real estate, but I think of a lot of the regulations that came out around Airbnb. I mean, to use an example, the initial idea was if you have a spare bedroom, list it, lease it out. But it turned into operators then turned it into a business. You may argue either way whether that's a good thing or not. I personally do not believe that it has improved that market, and I do not believe that the ability of organizations to acquire space for the purpose of leasing benefits the ARIN community. The idea of leasing, I don't think is fundamentally wrong, as long as we can figure out how to remove the ability of organizations to do any sort of speculation through leasing.
Thank you. Final comment, Joe.
Joe Provo, Google ARIN-AC. I remembered my third point when Scott came out to the microphone. In this policy and a few others that have floated around, there's been some, hey, we're unlike other RARs in X. Yeah, that's true, we are. Specifically in the V4 runout realm, we opted for hard landing, not soft landing. Other RARs opted for soft landing. One of the arguments for hard landing when we went down that road was the economic incentive to improve utilization of V6. This policy is attempting to undercut that incentive. And I'll reiterate, striking operational need requirement is a bad thing, so I don't endorse that. I do like, again, the LIR example that Mr. Bloomberg brought up is clearly about operating networks and not about speculation, so that area should be explored.
Thank you. All right. Concludes the discussion. Thank you, Rob, for your presentation.